The avoidant appears fearless on the surface. They end relationships without visible emotion. They walk away from people who love them without looking back. They create distance that seems effortless, withdraw in ways that appear calculated, maintain independence that looks like strength. You watch them operate with apparent confidence in their detachment, and you think they're not afraid of anything, that they're immune to the fears that govern most people's relational decisions. But this perception is completely backwards. The avoidant isn't fearless. They're operating from fear so profound, so pervasive, so consuming, that their entire life is organized around avoiding what terrifies them. Every cold behavior, every withdrawal, every emotional shutdown is driven by terror they can't consciously access and wouldn't admit if they could. Understanding what actually scares the avoidant is crucial, because their fear is what creates all the painful patterns you experience with them. They're not cruel because they don't care. They're cruel because they're terrified, and their terror makes them choose self-protection over connection every single time. What scares the avoidant isn't what scares most people. They're not primarily afraid of being alone, of being single, of not having relationship. Those are the fears that drive anxiously attached people. But the avoidant's fears are inverted. The avoidant is afraid of the things most people want. They're terrified of closeness, of vulnerability, of needing someone, of being needed, of commitment, of emotional intimacy. All the things that create bonding and partnership and deep connection are perceived by the avoidant's nervous system as threats to survival. This inverted fear structure is what makes relationships with avoidants so confusing and painful. You're offering them what seems like obvious goods, love, stability, partnership, and they're responding as if you're offering them danger. They're running from what you're trying to give them because what you're offering activates every terror their psychology is built to avoid. The avoidance fear isn't rational. It's not based on accurate assessment of current reality. It's rooted in childhood experiences where intimacy was paired with pain, where needing caregivers led to disappointment or hurt, where vulnerability was exploited or punished. The avoidant learned young that emotional closeness is dangerous, that depending on people leads to suffering, that showing need results in rejection or harm. These early lessons got encoded in their nervous system at a level deeper than conscious thought, and now as adults their nervous system responds to intimacy as if it's the same threat it was in childhood, even though the circumstances are completely different. The avoidant is afraid of things that aren't actually dangerous now, but their fear doesn't update based on new information. It stays locked in childhood conclusions, driving adult behavior that destroys adult relationships. They're terrified of needing anyone. The deepest fear the avoidant carries is the terror of needing someone. Need feels like death to the avoidant psychology. Needing someone means depending on them, means being vulnerable to being hurt by them, means losing control over your own emotional state. The avoidant learned in childhood that needing people is dangerous because the people they needed weren't consistently available or were actively harmful. So they developed a psychology that tries to eliminate need entirely, that positions independence as the highest value, that interprets any feeling of needing someone as emergency level threat, requiring immediate distancing. When the avoidant starts to need you, when they notice they're thinking about you frequently, or missing you when you're not around or wanting your specific presence, panic sets in. The need itself is terrifying regardless of whether you're actually going to meet that need. The avoidant isn't evaluating whether you're trustworthy or consistent. They're responding to the internal experience of need, as if need itself is the danger. They're terrified that needing you gives you power over them, that dependency creates vulnerability, that if they need you and you leave or hurt them, they won't survive the loss. The fear of need is what drives their withdrawal when the relationship is deepening, because deepening relationship inevitably creates more need. The avoidant is also terrified of you needing them. When you express needs, when you ask for consistency or emotional availability or commitment, the avoidant experiences your needs as suffocating pressure. They're afraid they can't meet your needs. They're afraid that if they try to meet your needs and fail, you'll abandon them. They're afraid that your needs will expand until they consume all their autonomy and freedom. They're afraid that being needed means being trapped, being responsible for someone else's emotional state, being unable to leave without causing devastation. Your needs, no matter how reasonable, activate the avoidant's terror about being inadequate and about losing themselves in trying to meet someone else's requirements. The terror of need is why the avoidant maintains such fierce independence. The independence isn't actually about being self-sufficient. It's about avoiding need. The avoidant structures their life so they don't need anyone for anything important. They don't need emotional support because they handle emotions alone. They don't need physical help because they do everything themselves. They don't need companionship because they've learned to be comfortable in isolation. Every declaration of "I don't need anyone" is really saying "I'm terrified of needing anyone, so I've organized my entire life around avoiding need." The independence is defensive, not authentic. It's protection against the terror of dependency that the avoidant experienced as catastrophic in childhood. They're terrified of being fully known. The avoidant is deeply afraid of being truly seen and known by another person. Being fully known means showing all the parts of yourself, including the wounded parts, the scared parts, the parts you're ashamed of. It means letting someone see your flaws, your limitations, your fears, your insecurities. For the avoidant, this level of visibility feels like standing naked in front of someone who might judge or reject or mock or abandon them once they see the truth of who they are beneath the defended surface. The avoidant believes fundamentally that if you really knew them, you wouldn't love them, so they keep you from really knowing them as protection against inevitable rejection. The terror of being known is why the avoidant keeps relationships at surface level. They share facts but not feelings. They tell stories but not vulnerabilities. They present a curated version of themselves that's acceptable, competent together. But underneath that presentation is a person who feels broken, inadequate, unlovable. The avoidant is terrified that if they let you see the underneath parts, you'll confirm their worst fears about themselves. They're protecting you from their real self, while protecting themselves from your potential rejection of that real self. The distance they create isn't because they don't want intimacy. It's because intimacy requires being known, and being known feels like a certain path to abandonment. The avoidant is especially terrified of you knowing about their needs and fears. Admitting they need you means you know they're not actually independent. Admitting they're scared means you know they're not actually strong. Admitting they care deeply about you means you know they're not actually detached. Every admission of internal truth contradicts the image they're trying to maintain, and that image is their protection. The avoidant believes that if you see their vulnerability, you'll use it against them, or you'll lose respect for them, or you'll leave them for someone less damaged. So they hide everything. They perform strength. They maintain mystery, all to avoid the terror of being fully known and then rejected for what you learn. The terror of being known also includes fear of being understood. When someone truly understands you, they can predict you, they know your patterns, they see through your defenses. This understanding feels like loss of control to the avoidant. If you understand them too well, you might manipulate them or pressure them or make demands based on what you know about them. The avoidant wants to be unknowable as protection against anyone having power over them through understanding. Every time you demonstrate that you see through their defenses, every time you understand what they're feeling before they express it, the avoidant experiences alarm. Your understanding, which you're offering as gift of intimacy, they're receiving as threat to their self-protection. They're terrified of losing control. Control is the avoidant's primary coping mechanism, and anything that threatens their control activates intense fear. The avoidant maintains control over their emotional state by not getting too attached. They maintain control over the relationship by always being the one who can leave, who wants less, who needs less. They maintain control over outcomes by never hoping for too much, never expecting too much, never wanting too much. This control feels like safety, and anything that compromises it feels like danger. When you push for more intimacy, more consistency, more commitment, you're threatening their control, and they respond with fear disguised as coldness or anger. The avoidant is terrified specifically of losing control over their emotional state. They've spent their life learning to regulate their own emotions through cognitive strategies and distancing. They don't rely on other people for emotional regulation, because relying on others means giving them control over how you feel. But when you become important to the avoidant, When attachment forms, your behavior starts affecting their emotional state in ways they can't control. Whether you're warm or cold affects how they feel. Whether you're available or distant impacts their mood. This involuntary emotional reactivity to you is terrifying because it means you have power over their internal experience, and that power feels like you could destroy them if you chose to. The terror of losing control is why the avoidant maintains distance even when they want closeness. Closeness means interdependence, means mutual influence, means loss of complete control over your own life. The avoidant is afraid that if they let you in fully, if they build a life with you, they'll lose the ability to make unilateral decisions about their life. They'll have to consider you, accommodate you, negotiate with you. Their autonomy will be compromised by your presence and your needs and your desires. For most people, this loss of complete autonomy is acceptable trade-off for partnership. For the avoidant, it feels like losing themselves, like disappearing into the relationship, like psychological death. The avoidant is also terrified of you having control in the relationship. When you establish boundaries, when you require certain behavior, when you have standards they need to meet, you're exerting control over the relationship parameters. The avoidant experiences this as intolerable even when your boundaries are reasonable. They need to be the one with power, the one who determines the terms, the one who can leave if things get too uncomfortable. Your boundaries threaten their power structure, and the threat creates fear that manifests as resistance or rebellion against even legitimate requirements. The avoidant would rather lose you than accept that you have some control over how the relationship functions. They're terrified of being trapped. The avoidant's fear of entrapment is visceral and overwhelming. Commitment feels like a cage. Defined relationships feel like obligation. Someone depending on them feels like being chained. The avoidant experiences normal relationship progression as progressive loss of freedom, and the fear of reaching a point where they can't escape is ever present. This fear of entrapment is why the avoidant keeps one foot perpetually out the door. They need to know they could leave at any moment. They need to maintain psychological and practical exit routes. Being trapped feels like suffocation, like drowning, like dying slowly while being unable to get free. The terror of entrapment is activated by all the relationship milestones most people celebrate. Moving in together feels like losing the ability to be alone. Meeting each other's families feels like being integrated into structures that create obligation. Talking about marriage feels like signing away freedom forever. Having children feels like being permanently bound to someone with no possibility of escape. Every normal progression toward deeper commitment is interpreted by the avoidant as another level of being trapped. What you experience as building a life together, they experience as constructing a prison they're terrified they'll regret entering. The avoidant is also terrified of emotional entrapment even without practical commitment. When they start caring deeply about you, when you become important to them, they feel trapped by their own feelings. They can't control caring about you. They can't force themselves to stop thinking about you. Their emotions about you are creating bonds that feel like chains. The avoidant is trapped inside their own attachment, and the only way they know to escape the trap of their feelings is to create distance from you. The withdrawal isn't because they don't care, it's because they care too much, and caring feels like entrapment they're desperate to escape. The terror of being trapped is also about fear of making the wrong choice. The avoidant is afraid that if they commit fully to you, if they close the door on other options, they might discover later that you weren't the right choice. They're terrified of regret, of being stuck with someone they shouldn't be with, of missing out on someone better who might come along. This fear keeps them from fully choosing you even when they want to. They maintain ambiguity, they avoid labels, they resist defining the relationship because definition feels like trap that eliminates all other possibilities. The avoidant wants to be with you while maintaining the option of not being with you, and commitment requires releasing that option. They're terrified of abandonment that they can't control. This fear seems contradictory, given how often the avoidant is the one leaving, but it's fundamental to understanding their psychology. The avoidant is terrified of being abandoned by someone who matters to them. Their entire childhood was characterized by abandonment, whether physical or emotional, and the pain of those abandonments shaped their entire relational strategy. But the avoidant's response to fear of abandonment is completely opposite to the anxiously attached response. Instead of clinging and pursuing, the avoidant abandons first. They leave before they can be left. They end things before they can be ended on. They create the loss they fear in order to have control over when and how it happens. The terror of uncontrolled abandonment is why the avoidant pulls away when the relationship is going well. When things are good, when you're both happy, when the relationship is deepening, the avoidant starts anticipating the inevitable end. They're certain you'll eventually leave because everyone eventually leaves. They're convinced you'll discover they're not enough and you'll abandon them. Rather than wait for this abandonment to happen on your timeline, they start creating distance on their timeline. They're trying to abandon the relationship before it can abandon them, trying to hurt you before you can hurt them, trying to maintain the only power they believe they have, the power to leave first. The avoidant is also terrified of the pain of abandonment. They know how much abandonment hurts because they've experienced it repeatedly. They've felt the devastation of being left by someone who mattered. They've experienced the shame of caring more than they were cared about. They've endured the grief of losing connection they depended on. And they've decided at a core level that they will never be that vulnerable to that kind of pain again. Every defensive strategy they employ, every way they keep you at distance, every time they leave before they can be left, it's all in service of avoiding the pain of abandonment they're certain is coming. The terror of abandonment is what makes the avoidant test you constantly. They pull away to see if you'll chase. They're cold to see if you'll leave. They create problems to see if you'll stay through difficulty. These tests aren't conscious manipulation. They're the avoidance nervous system trying to determine whether you're safe, whether you'll abandon them, whether they can trust you not to leave. But the tests are often what drives you away, creating the exact abandonment they feared. The avoidant creates self-fulfilling prophecies where their fear of abandonment drives behavior that causes abandonment, which confirms their belief that everyone leaves, which reinforces their need to leave first next time. They're terrified of their own feelings. The avoidant is afraid of the intensity of their own emotional experience. When they start developing real feelings for you, when they care deeply, when they experience love or longing or desire, these emotions feel overwhelming and dangerous. The avoidant doesn't trust their feelings. They don't know how to sit with emotional intensity without being consumed by it. They've learned to manage life through cognitive control and emotional suppression, and strong feelings threaten that entire system. When they feel too much for you, they experience the feelings themselves as threat, and they respond by shutting down emotionally or creating distance to reduce the feeling's intensity. The terror of their own feelings is why you see the avoidant become coldest after moments of genuine intimacy. When they've been vulnerable with you, when they've let their guard down, when they've experienced real emotional connection, the aftermath is panic. They're afraid of how much they felt, afraid of the vulnerability they displayed, afraid of the need and desire that surfaced. So they create immediate distance to regain control over their emotional state, to reestablish their defenses, to protect themselves from the danger of continuing to feel that intensely. The coldness after intimacy is the avoidant managing their terror about the intensity of what they experienced during intimacy. The avoidant is also terrified of positive feelings specifically. Love, joy, contentment, hope. These emotions feel dangerous because they require vulnerability and they create attachment. When the avoidant feels happy with you, alarm bells go off. Happiness means they're attached. Attached means they're vulnerable. Vulnerable means they could be hurt. So the positive feelings themselves trigger defensive responses. The avoidant can't let themselves enjoy the good feelings because enjoying them means staying in them, means getting more attached, means increasing the potential pain if the relationship ends. They have to manage happiness down, suppress contentment, avoid hope, all to protect themselves from the vulnerability that positive feelings create. The terror of feelings is also why the avoidant intellectualizes everything. They turn emotions into thoughts, experiences into analysis, feelings into concepts. When you say you love them, they think about what love means rather than feeling the love. When they're hurt, they analyze why they're hurt rather than sitting with the hurt. The intellectualization is distance from the feeling, protection from the intensity, control over experience that would otherwise overwhelm them. The avoidant is terrified of being in their emotional experience without the mediation of their rational mind, so they stay in their head as protection against being in their heart. They're terrified of repeating their childhood pain. Underneath all the avoidance specific fears is one foundational terror, that they'll experience again the pain they experienced as a child. The avoidance childhood involved some combination of emotional neglect, inconsistent caregiving, rejection of vulnerability, punishment for needs, or outright abandonment. The pain of those experiences was so profound that the avoidant's entire psychology organized around never experiencing that kind of pain again. Every fear they have, every defensive strategy they employ, every way they push you away is ultimately about avoiding re-experiencing the unbearable pain of their childhood wounds. The avoidant looks at intimate relationship and sees potential for the same pain they experienced before. You could neglect them like their caregivers did. You could be inconsistent like their parents were. You could reject their vulnerability like they were rejected. You could punish them for having needs like they were punished. You could abandon them like they were abandoned. The avoidant doesn't see these as possibilities. They see them as inevitabilities. They're certain that intimacy leads to this pain because their early experiences taught them intimacy, and pain are inseparable. So they avoid intimacy not because they don't want it, but because they're terrified. Intimacy will lead straight back to the unbearable suffering they experienced when they were small and powerless. The terror of repeating childhood pain is why the avoidant can't take your reassurances at face value. When you say you won't leave, they don't believe you because people they needed said similar things and then left. When you say you accept them as they are, they don't trust it because acceptance was conditional in their childhood. When you say you'll be consistent, they're waiting for the inevitable inconsistency they experienced before. You're not you to the avoidant. You're a stand-in for every person who hurt them before. Their terror isn't about you specifically. It's about what you represent. Another opportunity to be devastated in the ways they were devastated before. The avoidant is also terrified of discovering they're unlovable in the same way they felt unlovable as a child. Their childhood experiences taught them something was wrong with them, that they were too much or not enough, that their real self was unacceptable. They're terrified that if they show you their real self, you'll confirm what they already believe about themselves, that they're fundamentally flawed and unworthy of love. This terror keeps them hidden, keeps them performing, keeps them protected behind defenses that prevent you from seeing the wounded child they're still carrying. The avoidant isn't afraid you won't love them. They're afraid you'll confirm they're unlovable, which would mean the pain of their childhood was justified, which would be unbearable. What their fear means for you and the relationship. Understanding what actually scares the avoidant should create compassion for them, while also clarifying the reality of what you're dealing with. The avoidant is terrified, genuinely terrified, of the things that create relationship. They're not choosing to be difficult. They're operating from fear so profound it controls their entire relational life. But compassion for their fear doesn't obligate you to stay in relationship with someone whose fear makes them incapable of partnership. Understanding why they're afraid doesn't make their fear-based behavior acceptable. You can have empathy for their terror while refusing to accept treatment that hurts you. The avoidance fears won't change without intensive therapeutic work. Fear this deep, rooted in childhood trauma, encoded in the nervous system, doesn't resolve through relationship experiences or through love or through patience. It resolves through professional help, through trauma work, through therapy that specifically addresses attachment wounds and helps the avoidant develop capacity to tolerate the feelings that terrify them. If the avoidant isn't doing this work, their fears will continue driving behavior that destroys relationships. Your understanding of their fear won't heal their fear. Your accommodation of their fear-based behavior won't reduce their fear. Only their own work can change their relationship with their terror. You also need to understand that the avoidance fear will make them hurt you. Not because they want to hurt you, but because their self-protection from their fear takes priority over your well-being. When they're afraid of needing you, they'll withdraw in ways that leave you feeling abandoned. When they're afraid of being known, they'll maintain distance that makes you feel rejected. When they're afraid of losing control, they'll resist your legitimate boundaries in ways that create conflict. When they're afraid of being trapped, they'll refuse commitment in ways that keep you in limbo. When they're afraid of abandonment, they'll leave you first in ways that break your heart. The avoidance terror drives behavior that transfers their pain onto you, and understanding their fear doesn't make that transfer acceptable. The avoidance fear is what makes relationship with them impossible unless they're actively working to heal. You can't accommodate fear this pervasive. You can't adjust yourself enough to not trigger it. You can't be patient enough to wait for it to resolve on its own. The fear will always be there, always be driving their behavior, always be creating the patterns that make intimacy impossible. Understanding what scares them should help you recognize you're not the problem. Their fear-based reactions aren't about you, and staying in relationship with someone this terrified without them doing intensive work is choosing to be hurt repeatedly by their attempts to manage terror that has nothing to do with you and everything to do with wounds they're not healing. Their fear is real, their pain is valid, their terror is understandable. But none of that makes them capable of the relationship you need unless they face what terrifies them instead of organizing their entire life around avoiding it.